Well, we started the work on the Target Malaria project in Africa quite a few years ago, when there were a couple of converging issues that came to our attention. The first was a position that the African Union had made sanctioning the release of GM and gene-derived mosquitoes on the continent, as well as the decision before the Conference of the Parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity around release of gene-derived organisms into the environment. So these two issues converged with the Target Malaria project that was quite active in Burkina Faso. And as we know, that in, I think it was July 2019, they released around 6,000 GM mosquitoes. So our work had a few components to it. One was looking at regulatory issues, so looking at where the discussion was at the African Union level, issues around transparency, issues around biosafety, risk assessment and capacity building and readiness of Africa to regulate GM mosquitoes, because gene-derived mosquitoes don't exist in the world. But we do know that GM mosquitoes have been released around, around the world in a few countries, the Cayman Islands, Malaysia, the US, Brazil, and so on. So we focus principally on GM mosquitoes, but then also looking at the Target Malaria project and its plans to release gene-derived mosquitoes as part of the third phase of its work. So following on from the regulatory issues, the political issues at play within Africa, particularly the funding by the Gates Foundation of African scientists who came en masse to the COP and actively blocked a moratorium, which we were campaigning for on gene-derived releases. We began to look a little bit more closely at what was going on in Burkina Faso in particular in regard to the financial imperatives underpinning malaria, and in particular gene-drive. So we looked at, in the context of our financialization of malaria paper, not only at GM mosquitoes and gene-drive mosquitoes, but we looked at where research and development was taking place, what products were being brought to the market, how effective these were, juxtaposed to the systemic issues at play that is keeping kind of the malaria issue alive on the continent, and how far apart the systemic solutions are to systemic problems, and these batch of solutions on the table at the moment, those in the offing like gene-drive and GM mosquitoes, as well as how the money around this is operating. That was the rationale and genesis for looking at the financialization, because we began to look at the emphasis on vector control, on resistance, and the treadmill that these products were kind of part of. So there were these insecticide-treated nets, looking at patented drugs, looking at vaccines, and then GM mosquitoes. And then we began to see a picture emerging around who is investing in the technologies. If we call this a package of vector control resistant technologies, they had kind of a common donor, mainly the Gates Foundation, which I think is like kind of the kingpin of, I think, rogue capital, pushing or driving investment in malaria products. And when you're thinking about investment in malaria products, you're also looking at the extent to which these products stand in the way of other solutions, because this is where investment is directed, and then looking at what kind of investment. It's no longer, investment of old, where you would get development aid or debt linked investments, governments taking more and more money from the IMF and World Bank and then maybe investing in malaria research and products. No, this we found to be completely on another level, where we found financial markets, banks, offshore investments, all involved in product development, patented product development for malaria. And we began to see kind of a pattern emerging around commodification of diseases on the continent, because it's not peculiar only to malaria, how this is financialized by rogue capital, and also how these investments operate in climates where regimes are typically authoritarian, where there's very little public oversight, not because there's a lack of willingness on the public to do so, but because of the draconian nature of governments, where there's a great deal of secrecy and untransparency, and where rogue capital can operate freely. I think that the Gates Foundation, their involvement in the GM and gene drive mosquito project on the continent through the Target Malaria project, and now more recently the Oxitec project in Djibouti, has a footprint in controlling kind of research and development and product development of malaria on the continent for a long time. So we know that not only is the Gates Foundation one of the biggest donors of the WHO, but they also fund the primary fund established under the WHO to combat malaria and TB. I think the Gates Foundation kind of laid the groundwork for and opened the doors to the financialization of malaria in Africa. I think we wanted to bring to the attention of African governments that first, you are complicit in state capture, looting of the state. Why did you find yourselves in a position that you had to take so many loans from the IMF and World Bank, so that you became so indebted that you were unable to invest in your own public research institutions to come up with homegrown solutions to your problems? Why are you unable to guarantee every citizen of your country access to clean water, sanitation, and a decent quality of life, a meaningful life? Why are you not taking these simple measures that will go a long way towards eradication of the disease? And so we found that African governments created this enabling environment for rogue capital to operate and commodify and control a disease. Who invests, how much is invested, the trajectory of products, what products will come to the market. And we know that there's a very close relationship between the Gates Foundation machinery, investment in diseases, and the corporate sector, particularly the pharmaceutical industry, who are the primary beneficiaries of product development in healthcare, as well as the agrochemical industry in the supply of pesticides. So it's almost like it's a whole cabal of actors who are present also in other extractive industries across the continent. It may not be the same people, but it's cut from the same cloth. And we see this very much as ongoing extractivism from the continent. Table. So I think that it was important for us to bring to the attention of the world and decision makers that there's nothing benevolent about Gates-funded projects directed at population eradication, eradicating the population of mosquitoes or bringing down the numbers drastically or killing off the male species or sterility in the female or whatever it is, whatever combinations of variables they bring to the table. We wanted to show the world that this is not benign. There are huge financial motives and people are making money out of these unproven and risky technological interventions in respect of which we know very little around the risks. We are yet to see peer-reviewed studies showing or at least answering some very important questions that we have already posed to Target Malaria and Oxitec around the release of GM mosquitoes. We would like to see the results. Are there correlations between the release of these millions of GM mosquitoes elsewhere in the world and the incidence of malaria? So I think that it was important for us to bring to the attention of the world and decision makers that there's nothing benevolent about Gates-funded projects directed at population eradication, eradicating the population of mosquitoes or bringing down the numbers drastically or killing off the male species or sterility in the female or whatever it is, whatever combinations of variables they bring to the table. We wanted to show the world that this is not benign. There are huge financial motives and people are making money out of these unproven and risky technological interventions in respect of which we know very little around the risks. We are yet to see peer-reviewed studies showing or at least answering some very important questions that we have already posed to Target Malaria and Oxitec around the release of GM mosquitoes. We would like to see the results. Are there correlations between the release of these millions of GM mosquitoes elsewhere in the world and the incidence of malaria going down or eradication of malaria? We would like to see an honest discussion about risks. What's happening with insect ecology? What is happening with evolution of the mosquito populations who are inheriting transgenic traits, for example? So we believe that Africa is overexploited. This is a continuing trajectory of that exploitation, and it's just taking on different forms. And this is borne out by the extent to which Target Malaria did not abide by internationally recommended protocols around prior informed consent and what constitutes ethical conduct when conducting medical and health-related experiments. As we know, that they paid a pittance to communities in Burkina Faso to expose their legs for long periods of time in order to allow these people to be bitten, to assist the project with their experimentation. And that itself, we believe, is highly unethical because these people were then placed at risk of contracting malaria. And there were no safeguards put in place to ensure that whoever contracted malaria as a result of such exposure would receive prompt and appropriate medical intervention and health care. So, just a lot of problems, many dynamics around it, but I think we wanted to show how raw capital operates when you talk about malaria and how this is tied and linked with the GM and gene drive project, particularly of Target Malaria. It's like money making money out of money, invest, like say offshore investments, pension funds as well, where there's no relationship like between the worker and what he knows or she knows about where the money's been invested. A lot of pension funds are invested in highly extractive projects. So these could be bankrolled through offshore financial investment companies like BlackRock, for example, who holds like the debt of Zambia. And they would then invest the money in marketable investments that give good profits, and where there's no accountability to shareholders or no regulatory oversight. And there is like speculation in whatever could be the best investable enterprise giving maximum return, with there being no ethical or moral or human rights standards underpinning how this investment is made. And so they just make money out of money. So invest in a product that is patented, that will make more money out of selling of a patented product, and there will be some investment and no real benefit to the communities who are receiving at the receiving end, or Africa. So it kind of operates like a voracious machine. Its sole purpose is to make more money. There's no ethical considerations, there's no ecological considerations, there's no human rights considerations. It doesn't care what it destroys, what it exploits, how much ecological damage it causes, whether or not there could be prior informed consent. It just is rogue. It is out there and it is looking for any investment that will give a return. It could be an investment in making conflicts where no conflicts exist if it's going to bring a return on investment. So everything becomes commodified because it's investable, it's financialized, it's instrumentalized, and it has a single rogue purpose. Instead of, because look, malaria is a killer disease, okay? Diseases are public health concerns. We were in a 2-year pandemic shutdown, lockdown, because there was a virus out there. Public health concern. Malaria should be treated with urgency from the perspective of public health interventions that are directed towards assisting those who become infected, giving them timely, affordable health care, the best quality, and this should operate in tandem with structural measures taken towards long-term eradication, which is get rid of all the stagnant waters, the stagnant pools, clean water, sanitation, giving people a meaningful quality of life that goes hand in hand. But instead of that happening, and also putting the autonomy over malaria health care in the hands of the public sector, this has been taken out of that sphere and put in the private corporate sphere, the financial sphere, where financial institutions and financial instruments are used to direct the trajectory of product development, how long the disease will last, because this can last forever. Because we know that GM mosquitoes are not doing what it's supposed to do. So, is there, apart from exposing that malaria has become commodified, and when we were researching this, we asked the question, how much is a disease worth in Africa? It's worth a lot to those who are profiting from it, profiting from deaths. So it's like a perverse way of keeping us locked in the malaria cycle, because after years and years they can't control malaria because they have been down the rabbit hole of vector control and resistance. And the GM mosquito and gene drive projects are more of the same ilk. And we know that there's a lot of interest in gene drives for agricultural purposes, because they themselves down a rabbit hole wanting to gene drive fruit flies and insect pests that are pervasive in industrial agriculture. The conservation lobby are interested in getting rid of alien and invasive species, especially on small islands. It's an investable technology because it could give returns on the products that will be developed, because these products will not be given for free. And who is going to pay for these products in the future in Africa? Does it mean that Africa will have to take more loans to pay off these products that will keep us in a never-ending cycle, trapped in this malaria cycle? That means we will never eradicate malaria. I mean, is this the idea, that we will always keep Africa disease-ridden? I'm just asking the question because I can't see solutions here. I can just see money-making. And even if people have the best intentions, but your intentions must be matched with the right solutions, sustainable solutions that will benefit Africa, not financial investors and the corporate sector. I think that we are so far down the rabbit hole in Africa because of the authoritarian nature of almost all African governments. Their economies are inextricably tied with highly extractive industries, oil, gas, minerals. They have become even more indebted during the COVID pandemic. we have very little hope that they will ever be able to rise to the occasion and provide every African with access to clean water, to sanitation, to the kind of infrastructure we need, to proper housing. I think that plans made by most governments last as long as the election cycle. There's very little, by the way, of long-term planning for Africa's future, to ensure intergenerational equity, to ensure that the world that our children and grandchildren will inherit will be a better one. I'm afraid we're going to leave a really terrible legacy. But at the same time, there's always the agency of Africans. They have fought bravely back, especially in Burkina Faso, against the Target Malaria project. After 25 years of the first generation transgenic technology in food and agriculture, the biotech industry has very little to show for the millions that have been poured into the continent to open the continent up. What they have is a dismal failure in Burkina Faso again on GM cotton, which they had to, in a way, ban at huge losses. They have maybe 2.2 million hectares of GM crops in South Africa, very little for a highly industrialized food sector. It's maize, and that's a big one because that's a staple food. But they've been unable to take control of the maize market on the continent. They've now recently had an approval in Nigeria on maize, cotton and cowpea, but there's a backlash there, and the Senate has asked for the regulations to be redrafted. South Africa has taken a decision to regulate all new breeding technologies, including genome editing, all of them. So the fight will be to include from SDN1 to 3, and the industry has taken South Africa on appeal on this decision. South Africa also dismissed Monsanto's triple stack GM maize featuring the drought-tolerant maize trait. Kenya, after the Seralini report was published, banned the import of GM into their country. President Museveni still is not convinced enough to sign off on the biosafety law in Uganda because there's been considerable amount of resistance. Kenya has granted approval to a GM cassava and also maize and cotton, but there's also resistance there. It's not commensurate with the millions of dollars that US aid has poured into the country, into the continent. The Gates Foundation, since the Gates Foundation doesn't give money through AGRA for GM, through the Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa for GM research and development and biosafety, capacity building and pushing the GM agenda. They have just, funding from the Gates Foundation itself to GM projects on the continent. They fund also the mining of genetic data, digital sequence information, through the African Orphans Crop Consortium, for example. So a lot of this is going on, but we can say that Gates has managed to shift in agriculture the discussion firmly at policy level within the Green Revolution paradigm. But there's also a huge groundswell of movements in favor of transition towards just food systems, also just health, and a just transition in energy. but in food and agriculture, a groundswell of support for transitions to agroecology. So there's always hope, and we can never ever underestimate how unpredictable Africa really is, and also the agency of Africans. So inasmuch as the picture looks quite bleak, we can never live without hope. Look, I think that the money coming from Gates and how they strategically place themselves, it was a kind of a departure from the tactics of USAID. And I think that they are a threat and posing a huge amount of challenges for us, because they're funding scientists who straddle health, agriculture, biodiversity, ecology. So I think it is a problem, and we already saw the extent to which they were able to influence the outcome of the COP decision, and that was basically, at the end, it was just Africa who stood in the way of that moratorium, and it was down to, one negotiator from Latin America against the Africans at the end. So I think it's a huge challenge and a huge problem for us, because these young people will occupy spaces in research institutions in Africa, and they will have the ear of governments who will begin to rely on their expertise and knowledge, because a lot of decision making by African governments take place in consultation with research institutions. They don't come to us. They ask us as watchdogs to give inputs, but they don't ask us for advice. African governments ask other experts who are in research institutions for advice. But how long these African scientists will remain in Africa and work on African issues is another issue. Or whether they will take the scholarships and move to the north and work for northern institutions is also another eventuality. But we have to see how the future unfolds. But this is definitely a problem, because we have seen also the voices of these probiotic scientists being amplified by the Alliance for Science, funded by the Gates Foundation, and the extent to which they highlight or give a platform for these African scientists to peddle the wares of the probiotic machinery. And it's sad, because science should be in the public interest and not on the market for co-option by the highest bidder. But even science has become financialized and instrumentalized. And everything today, it appears, has a price tag.